The Civil War. Two men sat across from each other inside a Virginia farmhouse. One wore a clean gray uniform with a polished sword at his side. The other was caked in road mud from head to boot. The man in gray was surrendering. The man in mud had just won the bloodiest war in American history. April 9th, 1865. Appomattox Courthouse. 4 years of slaughter had left somewhere between 750,000 and 850,000 Americans dead, more than any war this country has ever fought, before or since. 11 southern states had broken away after Abraham Lincoln won the presidency. They were terrified he would end slavery. They built their own nation, the Confederate States of America, and planted their capital in Richmond, just 100 miles from Washington, close enough to see the smoke. What followed had no mercy in it. Antietam, Gettysburg, Cold Harbor, names that stopped meaning places and started meaning graves. By the final year, 1 in 4 Southern white men of fighting age was dead. Lee's army was starving, surrounded, and out of options. He rode to meet General Grant at a farmhouse owned by a man named Wilmer McLean. Here's the detail that sounds invented but wasn't. McLean had fled to Appomattox specifically to escape the war. The first major battle, Bull Run, had been fought directly on his previous property. The war followed him anyway. He later said it began in his front yard and ended in his front parlor. Lee arrived dressed in his finest uniform, expecting chains, maybe a firing squad. Grant walked in still covered in the mud of an all-night ride and offered terms that stunned the room. Confederate soldiers could go home. Officers kept their sidearms. Farmers kept their horses for spring planting. No hangings, no prison, no punishment. The war was over. The healing could start. It lasted 5 days. On the night of April 14th, Lincoln sat in a box seat at Ford's Theater. A Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped in behind him, pressed a small pistol to the back of his skull, and pulled the trigger. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He died the following morning on April 15th, the first American president ever killed in office. Booth jumped to the stage, snapped a bone in his leg on landing, and screamed at the crowd before vanishing into the night. 12 days later, soldiers cornered him inside a burning barn and shot him dead. But the war didn't stop. Information moved slowly in 1865. Confederate units scattered across Texas had no word that Lee had surrendered. They kept fighting for weeks. The very last Confederate general to put down his weapons was Stand Watie, a Cherokee leader who commanded the 1st Cherokee Mounted Rifles. He surrendered on June 23, 1865 at Dokesville in Indian Territory. 2.5 months after Appomattox, the Civil War ended slavery and held the country together. But the man who carried it through never lived to see what came next. Abraham Lincoln was buried in Springfield, Illinois. The damage he died trying to repair has never fully healed. World War II, Pacific. The night before Japan told the world it had lost, a group of its own officers tried to make sure it never happened. They stormed the Imperial Palace in Tokyo with weapons drawn. They were hunting a recording. Emperor Hirohito had just finished taping a message to his people, announcing surrender. No Japanese citizen had ever heard the emperor's voice. These men were determined no one ever would. They believed Japan should burn to the last person before it surrendered. 2 atomic bombs had already erased Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union had invaded Manchuria. None of it was enough for them. They murdered the commander of the Imperial Guard. They cut phone lines. They forged military orders. They searched the palace room by room for hours. They never found it. The recording had been sealed inside a small safe, wrapped in a cloth bag, buried among stacks of paperwork. By dawn on August 15, 1945, the coup had fallen apart. Several of the officers walked outside onto the palace grounds, drew their blades, and killed themselves. That morning, radios across Japan carried the emperor's voice for the first time in history. He spoke in formal ancient Japanese that most ordinary people could barely follow. But one word landed on everyone the same way: surrender. Soldiers dropped to their knees in the streets. Women collapsed where they stood. Thousands of military officers took their own lives rather than accept it. Some with swords, others with grenades, many right outside the palace gates. 2 weeks later, the formal end came aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. Japanese officials in formal dress stood on deck and faced General Douglas MacArthur. Directly behind him stood 2 men who should not have been alive to see it. General Wainwright, who had surrendered the Philippines to Japan. General Percival, who had surrendered Singapore. Both had spent years in Japanese prison camps. Both had been tortured. Now they watched their former captors sign the documents that ended it all. MacArthur kept the ceremony to 18 minutes. When it was done, More than 1,000 American aircraft roared over the bay in formation. The Pacific War was over. 2 million Japanese dead. More than 100,000 Americans. 2 cities gone. An empire that had stretched from China to the edge of Australia had collapsed in 4 years. But not everyone knew. Japanese soldiers on remote islands had no radios and no way to receive the news. Some kept fighting for years. One of them kept fighting for decades. Second Lieutenant Hiru Onoda was stationed on Lubang Island in the Philippines. He refused to believe any report that the war had ended. He fought alone in the jungle, running a one-man guerrilla campaign for 29 years. In March 1974, his former commanding officer made the journey to Lubang Island personally. He found Onoda in the jungle and officially relieved him of duty, face to face. Onoda emerged in his original uniform, handed over his rifle, and accepted that it was over. The Empire of the Rising Sun had been gone for 3 decades. One of its soldiers had never stopped fighting. The Korean War. The Korean War never actually ended. Most people don't realize that. Generals from both sides met on July 27, 1953, in a small building at Panmunjom. They did not sign a peace treaty. They signed a ceasefire, a temporary pause. The document said it would hold until a final peaceful settlement could be reached. That was over 70 years ago. No settlement ever came, and notably, South Korea refused to sign the agreement at all. It had started 3 years earlier. At dawn on June 25, 1950, 75,000 North Korean soldiers poured across the 38th parallel. Seoul fell in 3 days. Within 6 weeks, American and South Korean forces had been pushed into a tiny strip of land around the city of Busan. Just 10% of the entire country. It looked like the end. Then General Douglas MacArthur gambled everything. He launched an amphibious landing at Incheon, deep behind North Korean lines. His own military planners put the odds of success at 5,000 to 1. He did it anyway. The North Korean army crumbled almost overnight. UN forces swept north, took Pyongyang, and pushed all the way to the Chinese border at the Yalu River. Then China entered the war. 300,000 soldiers crossed the Yalu in late October 1950, and the Americans never saw them coming. UN forces were driven back south in one of the most brutal retreats in American military history. The worst of it happened at the Chosan Reservoir. 30,000 Marines and soldiers found themselves completely surrounded by 120,000 Chinese troops. Temperatures dropped to minus 35 degrees. Morphine syringes froze solid before they could be used. Boots froze to feet. The dead froze where they fell and could not be buried. When a reporter asked Marine General O.P. Smith if his men were retreating, he said, "Retreat? Hell, we're just advancing in a different direction." They broke out of the encirclement and fought their way to the port of Hungnam. By spring 1951, the front lines had settled back almost exactly where the war had started. The 38th parallel. For 2 more years, men died taking hills that were abandoned the following week. Porkchop, Heartbreak Ridge, Old Baldy. The ceasefire talks dragged on for 575 days while the killing continued. When it was finally over, nothing had moved. The border sat where it began. Korea stayed split in 2. More than 36,000 Americans were dead. An estimated 3 million Koreans and Chinese had been killed, most of them civilians. North Korea had been bombed so completely that almost no building taller than 1 story was left standing anywhere in the country. History mostly skipped past it. World War II got the glory, Vietnam got the anger, Korea got forgotten, but 28,000 American troops still stand watch along the DMZ today. The 2 Koreas are still at war on paper. The ceasefire that was supposed to be temporary has become the longest military truce in modern history. The guns went quiet in 1953. The war never ended. The Vietnam War. The most powerful military in the history of the world lost to an enemy fighting in sandals. 20 years, 500,000 troops on the ground. More bombs dropped than in all of World War II combined. Chemical weapons that stripped the jungle bare and poisoned the soldiers who used them. None of it worked. By April 1975, South Vietnam was coming apart faster than anyone had predicted. Cities expected to hold for months fell in hours. The North Vietnamese army moved south along Highway 1 like a wave, and nothing in its path survived. President Nguyen Van Thieu resigned on April 21st. He spent his final address cursing the Americans who had promised to protect his country. Then he boarded a plane to Taiwan with suitcases loaded with gold. 9 days later, it was done. On the morning of April 30th, a North Vietnamese tank designated Tank 843 crashed straight through the gates of the Independence Palace in Saigon. That image went around the world in hours. Inside the building, President Duong Van Minh had been in office for exactly 43 hours. He sat in the cabinet room, waiting. When a North Vietnamese officer walked in and told him to surrender, Minh said he was prepared to hand over power in an orderly way. The officer stopped him. "You have no power to hand over. You can only surrender unconditionally." At 2:30 that afternoon, Minh's voice went out over Radio Saigon. The Republic of Vietnam was gone, erased in a single broadcast. The chaos had started hours before that. Operation Frequent Wind was the biggest helicopter evacuation ever attempted, and it almost didn't happen in time. The American ambassador, Graham Martin, had refused to accept that Saigon was falling. He kept delaying the order to evacuate. By the time it finally came, the situation was already out of control. Thousands of Vietnamese who had worked alongside Americans fought to get through the embassy gates. Marines pushed crowds back with rifle butts. Families were ripped apart in the crush. Mothers lifted their children over razor wire and handed them to strangers. The last helicopter, call sign Swift 22, lifted off from the embassy roof at 7:53 in the morning on April 30th. It carried the final 11 Marine security guards. It left thousands of Vietnamese allies behind. Many of those left behind were sent to prison camps. Some were killed. Others spent years behind bars for nothing more than trusting the Americans who had promised to stand with them. 58,000 Americans came home in coffins. Another 300,000 came back wounded. Millions of Vietnamese on both sides were dead. And when it was all over, Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. Exactly the outcome Ho Chi Minh had fought for from the very beginning. Exactly the thing America had spent 2 decades and more than 58,000 lives trying to stop. The war that was meant to hold back a tide ended with American soldiers scrambling up a ladder to a rooftop, desperate to get out of a disaster of their own making.